You can't run forever!
Help her! Please help me!
There was a time when Emily Carter believed the hardest part of her life was finding the courage to walk away from a man who promised to love her but slowly turned her home into a place she feared. She believed surviving the abuse would be the greatest battle she would ever face. She was wrong. The deepest wound wasn't the bruises she hid beneath long sleeves or the sleepless nights spent wondering whether she would survive until morning. The deepest wound came years later on an ordinary autumn afternoon when someone knocked on her front door. Standing on the porch were the very people who had laughed when she begged for help. Her mother, her father, her brother, the family who told her to stop embarrassing them by talking about her marriage, the family who watched her leave with tears in her eyes and called her weak. Now every one of them was crying. They weren't there to judge her anymore. They weren't there to defend the man who had broken her spirit. They had come for something only Emily could give them. What could possibly force people who once turned their backs on their own daughter to stand outside her home with trembling hands and desperate eyes? And why did the woman they abandoned become the only person who could save them? Before the story reaches its final chapter, you'll discover how one decision changed every life connected to hers, and why the answer wasn't money alone. It was something none of them expected. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Emily never imagined that the happiest day of her life would quietly become the beginning of a journey she would spend years trying to escape. For nearly 2 years, Daniel carefully built an image that seemed impossible to question. He never raised his voice in front of other people. He surprised Emily with flowers at work. He remembered anniversaries, attended church with her parents, and volunteered to help neighbors whenever storms damaged fences or rooftops. To everyone around them, they looked like the couple other young families hoped to become. Their wedding photographs captured endless smiles, warm embraces, and promises spoken with complete confidence. Looking back years later, Emily would often stare at those pictures and wonder whether she had missed something obvious or whether some people simply become experts at hiding who they truly are until they know no one will believe the person standing beside them. Only a few weeks after they returned from their honeymoon, little moments began appearing that didn't seem important on their own. Daniel wanted to know who texted her. He questioned why she spent so much time talking to coworkers. He asked for passwords, insisting that married people should have no secrets. Emily convinced herself these were signs of love, not control. After all, everyone said marriage required adjustment. Everyone said the first year was always the hardest. She had no reason to believe those small compromises would slowly become the chains that trapped her inside a life she no longer recognized. The first time Daniel struck her, the silence afterward hurt almost as much as the blow itself. They had argued over something so small Emily struggled to remember it clearly years later. She believed it had started with a forgotten grocery item, but by the time the conversation ended, Daniel was accusing her of disrespecting him, embarrassing him, and refusing to listen. Before she could respond, his hand crossed the distance between them. The room fell completely still. Daniel stared at her with the same expression of disbelief that she felt herself. Within minutes he was crying, apologizing, and insisting he had never done anything like that before. He blamed exhaustion, pressure at work, and his own frustration. He promised it would never happen again. Emily accepted the apology because she desperately wanted to believe the nightmare had ended before it truly began. She covered the faint mark on her face with makeup the next morning and smiled through lunch with coworkers who noticed she seemed unusually quiet. Nobody asked the question she secretly wished someone would ask. Nobody looked closely enough to see the fear growing behind her eyes. The months that followed blurred together into a painful routine. Every peaceful week gave way to another argument. Every argument ended with another apology, and every apology became less convincing than the one before. Daniel learned exactly how far he could push before pulling her back with promises, gifts, and carefully chosen words. Emily stopped inviting friends to the house because she never knew which version of her husband would greet them. She avoided taking photographs because she no longer recognized the woman smiling at the camera. Sleep became difficult, meals became smaller, and simple decisions suddenly felt overwhelming. Yet whenever she gathered enough courage to hint that things were not going well, the responses she received left her feeling even more alone. Friends told her every marriage had challenges. Church members encouraged her to pray harder and remain patient. Television commercials spoke about perfect families gathering around dinner tables, making her wonder why everyone else seemed able to build the life she could not hold together. The loneliness became almost unbearable because it convinced her she was the only person living through this kind of pain. She had no idea that thousands of others were silently carrying the same burden while pretending everything was fine. Eventually, Emily reached the point where she could no longer hide the truth from her family. One Sunday afternoon, after carefully covering another bruise with makeup that refused to conceal it completely, she drove to her parents' home without telling Daniel where she was going. Her hands shook as she parked in the familiar driveway where she had spent countless childhood afternoons believing home was the safest place in the world. Linda welcomed her inside with a warm smile that quickly faded when she noticed the sadness on her daughter's face. Robert lowered the newspaper he had been reading, sensing something serious before Emily had spoken a single word. Fighting back tears, Emily explained everything she had been hiding for months. She described the insults, the controlling behavior, the fear that filled their home, and finally the violence she could no longer pretend had never happened. She expected disbelief at first, but she also believed that once they heard everything, they would protect her. She thought this would be the moment she finally stopped facing the nightmare alone. Instead, the conversation took a direction she could never have imagined, one that would leave a scar deeper than anything Daniel had ever done. Emily had spent the entire drive rehearsing what she wanted to say, convincing herself that once the truth left her lips, everything would finally begin to change. She believed her parents would hold her, tell her she had done the right thing by speaking up, and help her find a safe place to start over. Instead, the room grew painfully quiet. Linda looked at Robert before looking back at her daughter as though searching for the right words. Robert leaned back in his chair, folded his arms, and released a slow sigh that seemed to carry more disappointment than concern. Finally, Linda spoke. She reminded Emily that every marriage went through difficult seasons and warned her against making emotional decisions she might regret later. Robert added that arguments between husbands and wives were private matters and should never become family business unless every possible effort had been made to fix them. Emily interrupted, explaining that this was no longer about arguments. She described being pushed into walls, slapped during disagreements, and living in constant fear of saying the wrong thing. Her voice cracked as she admitted she sometimes lay awake listening for Daniel's footsteps, trying to guess what mood he would be in before he even opened the bedroom door. She expected those words to change everything. Instead, Jason, who had arrived halfway through the conversation after finishing work, laughed quietly and asked a question that Emily would remember for the rest of her life. "Are you really going to throw away your marriage because your husband loses his temper?" The sentence landed like another blow. She stared at her brother, unable to believe the person who had once promised to protect her was dismissing the pain she had hidden for so long. Linda moved closer and gently held Emily's hands, but her words offered no comfort. She explained that she too had experienced difficult moments during her own marriage and insisted that lasting relationships required endurance. She warned Emily that divorce carried consequences that extended far beyond the couple involved. People would talk, friends would choose sides, future relationships would become more complicated. She even suggested that Daniel's behavior might improve if Emily became more patient and avoided challenging him during stressful moments. Emily listened in stunned silence. It was as though every bruise, every tear, and every sleepless night had become invisible the moment they entered the conversation. Robert then spoke again, his voice calm but firm. He reminded Emily that Daniel had always treated the family with respect, helped whenever someone needed assistance, and had never shown anger in front of anyone else. "We've known him for years," he said. "That doesn't sound like the man we know." Those words broke something inside Emily. She realized that the image Daniel had carefully created over the years was now standing between her and the people she loved most. The man who frightened her every night was still the charming son-in-law her family proudly introduced to neighbors and church friends. She suddenly understood that convincing them would require more than telling the truth. She would somehow have to prove it, and she had nothing except her own memories and fading bruises. When Emily finally returned home that evening, Daniel was sitting in the living room as though he had been waiting for her all along. He looked at her for several seconds before calmly asking whether her family had enjoyed hearing all the terrible things she had said about him. Emily froze. She had never told him where she was going. Before she could answer, he smiled, a slow, confident smile that chilled her more than shouting ever had. Daniel explained that Robert had called him earlier that afternoon. According to Daniel, Emily had become emotional and exaggerated a few disagreements, but everything would be fine once she calmed down. Robert had encouraged him to be patient with her. Emily felt the room begin to spin. Her own father had called the man she was trying to escape before calling to ask whether she had arrived home safely. In that single moment, she understood that she no longer had a safe place to run. The conversation at her parents' house had not protected her. It had warned Daniel that she was beginning to resist him. His confidence wasn't coming from arrogance. It came from knowing that the people Emily trusted most had already chosen to believe him instead of her. The weeks that followed became more frightening than anything Emily had experienced before. Daniel no longer tried to hide that he knew exactly how isolated she had become. Whenever they argued, he reminded her that nobody believed her. He told her that even her own family thought she was overreacting. Those words slowly became another form of control because they contained just enough truth to make her question whether anyone would ever help if she cried out again. She stopped mentioning the abuse altogether. She went to work, smiled when coworkers greeted her, attended family dinners where everyone complimented Daniel for being such a devoted husband, and returned home carrying a secret that grew heavier every day. At Thanksgiving, Jason raised a toast, calling Daniel the kind of husband every family wished for. Everyone laughed. Daniel wrapped his arm around Emily's shoulders and kissed her forehead while relatives admired how happy they looked together. Emily forced herself to smile for the family photograph taken that afternoon. Years later, she would look at that picture and remember that only 12 hours earlier Daniel had thrown a glass across the kitchen, leaving tiny cuts on her arm that remained hidden beneath the sleeves of her sweater. The photograph captured a family celebrating together. It also captured a woman silently begging for someone, anyone, to notice that her smile never reached her eyes. Everything changed on a cold February night that Emily would never forget for as long as she lived. Daniel returned home later than usual after attending a company dinner. The smell of alcohol filled the room before he even spoke. At first, he seemed unusually cheerful, but the mood shifted almost instantly when he noticed that Emily had forgot to answer one of his text messages earlier that afternoon while she was attending a staff meeting. What began as another accusation quickly became a storm of anger unlike anything she had seen before. Furniture crashed against the walls, glass shattered across the floor. Emily tried to leave the room, but Daniel blocked the doorway. She pleaded with him to calm down, promising they could talk in the morning. Instead, his rage only grew stronger. For the first time since their marriage began, Emily genuinely believed she might not survive the night. As she struggled to pull away, her eyes landed on her car keys lying near the kitchen counter. At that moment, one thought filled her mind with complete certainty. If she stayed until sunrise, there might never be another chance to leave alive. Emily waited for the briefest opening, the kind of moment most people would never notice. Daniel turned toward the shattered dining chair, muttering to himself as he kicked broken wood across the floor. She grabbed her keys, slipped through the side entrance, and ran without looking back. The cold air burned her lungs as she reached her car, her hands shaking so badly that she dropped the keys twice before managing to unlock the door. Her heart pounded louder than the engine as she pulled away from the house. She didn't know exactly where she was going. She only knew she couldn't return. Every mile placed a little more distance between her and the fear she had lived with for years, yet the relief she expected never arrived. Instead, another terrifying question took its place. Where could she go when the people she trusted most had already made it clear they believed the man she was running from? She spent nearly an hour driving through unfamiliar streets before finally pulling into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner. Sitting alone inside her car, she rested her forehead against the steering wheel and cried until there were no tears left. When she finally looked at her reflection in the rearview mirror, she barely recognized herself. There was exhaustion in her eyes, fear in every breath, and a quiet determination she had never seen before. For the first time in years, Emily understood that surviving would depend entirely on her own courage. No rescue was coming, no one was arriving to tell her everything would be all right. Whatever happened next, she would have to face it alone. As dawn approached, Emily made one final attempt to reach her family. She dialed her mother's number with trembling fingers, hoping that perhaps everything would be different if they understood how serious the situation had become. Linda answered after several rings, her voice heavy with sleep. Emily struggled to find the words before finally whispering that she had left Daniel and had nowhere safe to stay. There was a long silence on the other end of the line before Linda spoke. Instead of asking whether Emily had been hurt or whether she was safe, she asked where Daniel was and whether he knew she had left. Emily explained that she didn't know and didn't care anymore because she genuinely feared for her life. Linda sighed softly and told her to think carefully before making a decision that could not easily be undone. She suggested returning home after everyone had calmed down and offered to arrange a meeting where both families could sit together and discuss their differences. Emily felt her hope slipping away with every sentence. She interrupted, saying this was no longer a disagreement between husband and wife. She was asking for protection. She needed somewhere to sleep without looking over her shoulder. Linda hesitated once more before quietly admitting that Robert didn't believe it would be wise for Emily to stay with them because Daniel might come looking for her and create problems for the entire family. Those words settled into Emily's heart with a pain she could scarcely describe. Her parents weren't refusing because they lacked space. They were refusing because helping their own daughter seemed more frightening than disappointing her. When the call ended, Emily remained frozen in the driver's seat, staring at the phone in disbelief. Home, the place she had imagined running toward since childhood, no longer existed. Later that afternoon, Emily gathered enough courage to drive to her parents' house anyway, convinced that speaking face-to-face might change their minds. Robert opened the front door but made no effort to invite her inside. Linda stood several feet behind him, her eyes filled with concern yet unwilling to challenge her husband's decision. Jason arrived only minutes later after Robert had called him. Within moments, the front porch became the setting for the conversation Emily would replay in her mind for years. Robert told her she was allowing fear to cloud her judgment, and insisted that leaving the marriage without first seeking counseling would only make matters worse. Jason accused her of humiliating the family and damaging Daniel's reputation with false accusations. He reminded her that everyone at church admired Daniel, and warned that people would eventually discover she had abandoned her marriage. Emily pleaded with them one last time, explaining that she had not come seeking money or sympathy. She only needed somewhere safe to sleep until she could rebuild her life. Robert looked away before quietly saying words that would echo through every difficult year that followed. "Emily, you've made your decision. Now you have to live with the consequences." Linda lowered her head but said nothing. Jason folded his arms as though the conversation were already over. Emily realized she was standing on the same front porch where her father had once waited proudly to walk her to her wedding car. Now that very doorway was closing against her. She turned around without another word, climbed back into her car and drove away while the people she loved remained standing together, watching her disappear without taking a single step to stop her. For the next several weeks, Emily existed one day at a time. She checked into an inexpensive motel using nearly everything left in her bank account before discovering that Daniel had frozen access to the joint funds. She counted every dollar, skipped meals whenever possible, and searched constantly for affordable places to live. Pride disappeared quickly when survival became the priority. She accepted extra shifts at work, cleaned offices on weekends, and quietly sold a few pieces of jewelry she had received as wedding gifts simply to pay for groceries and gasoline. At night, she lay awake wondering whether Daniel would somehow find her or whether she had made the biggest mistake of her life. The loneliness felt almost unbearable. Holidays passed without invitations from family. Birthday messages stopped arriving. Friends she had known for years slowly disappeared after hearing different versions of the story. Some believed she had abandoned a good husband. Others simply didn't want to become involved. Emily learned a painful truth that many people never imagine until they experience it themselves. Escaping abuse doesn't instantly bring peace. Sometimes it means losing nearly everything before life has a chance to begin again. Yet despite the uncertainty, there was one small difference that reminded her she had made the right choice. Every night she closed her apartment door, no matter how small or empty the room appeared, she no longer wondered whether she would wake up afraid. For the first time in years, silence no longer felt frightening. It felt like freedom, fragile but real. Months slowly turned into years, and little by little, Emily began rebuilding a life she once believed had been permanently destroyed. She enrolled in evening classes to strengthen her professional skills, accepted opportunities that once intimidated her, and eventually earned a promotion that surprised even her supervisors. Therapy helped her recognize that the shame she carried had never belonged to her. She met other women whose stories sounded painfully familiar, and through those conversations she realized she had never been as alone as she once believed. Instead of allowing her experiences to define her, Emily began volunteering with organizations that supported survivors of domestic abuse. She listened to frightened women tell stories almost identical to her own, and every time she encouraged someone to choose safety, she quietly remembered the frightened woman she had once been. Without realizing it, Emily became the person she had desperately needed years earlier. She wasn't wealthy, famous, or seeking recognition. She simply built a peaceful life founded on honesty, independence, and the belief that kindness should never require accepting cruelty. She believed the past had finally remained where it belonged. She had no idea that several hundred miles away, the carefully constructed image her family had defended so fiercely was beginning to collapse in ways none of them could have imagined. The choices they once celebrated were about to return with consequences that would eventually lead every one of them back to the front door of the daughter they had abandoned. For nearly 2 years after Emily disappeared from their daily lives, Robert, Linda, Jason, and Megan convinced themselves they had made the right decision. Whenever neighbors asked why Emily was no longer attending family gatherings, they simply explained that she needed time to sort out personal issues. Daniel continued visiting on holidays, bringing thoughtful gifts and maintaining the same calm, respectful personality everyone had admired from the beginning. He rarely spoke negatively about Emily. Instead, he described her as someone overwhelmed by stress who had chosen to walk away before giving their marriage another chance. That version of the story sounded reasonable, and because it required no uncomfortable questions, everyone accepted it without hesitation. Linda occasionally wondered whether she should reach out to her daughter, but each time she considered making the call, Robert reminded her that Emily had chosen this path herself. Jason remained convinced his sister had exaggerated everything. He even defended Daniel during conversations with friends, insisting people were too quick to label ordinary marital disagreements as abuse. Looking back years later, Jason would admit that he believed what was easiest rather than what was hardest. Accepting Emily's story would have required admitting that he had completely misjudged someone he welcomed into the family. Pride quietly became stronger than compassion, and the cost of that decision would eventually reach every corner of their lives. The first cracks in Daniel's carefully crafted image appeared where nobody in the Carter family was looking. Shortly after the divorce proceedings began, several employees at the company where Daniel worked filed complaints describing his explosive temper and controlling behavior. At first, management dismissed the concerns as personality conflicts, but incidents continued to multiply. Coworkers described meetings where Daniel erupted over minor mistakes, publicly humiliated younger employees, and blamed everyone else whenever projects failed. The confidence that once impressed people slowly transformed into arrogance. The charm that had won over Emily's family became increasingly difficult to maintain under constant pressure. Eventually, Daniel was placed on administrative leave, while the company conducted an internal investigation into multiple complaints. News of his suspension never reached Robert or Linda because Daniel continued presenting himself as a victim of office politics. He insisted jealous coworkers wanted his position and fabricated accusations to damage his reputation. Robert believed every word. He admired Daniel's determination to fight what he considered unfair treatment. Once again, the family defended him without asking a single difficult question. Emily, meanwhile, knew nothing about these developments. She had spent years building emotional distance from the past and had stopped searching for updates about the man she once feared. She believed the chapter was finally closed. Life, however, has a remarkable way of reopening doors people believe have been permanently locked. Around the same time Daniel's career began to unravel, Robert faced unexpected challenges of his own. The manufacturing company where he had worked for nearly 3 decades announced significant restructuring, leaving many longtime employees with reduced hours and uncertain futures. Although Robert remained employed, his income dropped sharply, forcing the family to reconsider retirement plans they had spent years carefully preparing. Medical expenses soon followed after Linda required ongoing treatment for a chronic health condition that insurance covered only partially. Savings that once seemed secure began disappearing month after month. Jason's construction business also struggled as rising costs and canceled contracts placed enormous pressure on his finances. What had once appeared to be temporary setbacks gradually became a pattern that affected everyone. Still, despite growing difficulties, nobody reached out to Emily. Pride remained stronger than necessity. They convinced themselves they would recover just as they always had. Whenever conversations became discouraging, Daniel reassured them that better days were ahead. He spoke confidently about investment opportunities, promising that one smart decision could solve many of their financial worries. Robert trusted him completely. After all, Daniel had always seemed knowledgeable about money, and years of believing in him made it difficult to imagine he could possibly be leading them toward another painful mistake. Daniel introduced Robert and Jason to what he described as an exclusive investment opportunity through a longtime business associate. According to him, the returns were steady, the risk was minimal, and several respected professionals had already committed substantial amounts of money. Robert hesitated at first, but Daniel patiently answered every concern, producing polished documents, impressive projections, and convincing explanations that seemed to remove every doubt. Jason, eager to recover losses in his struggling business, encouraged his father to participate before the opportunity disappeared. Linda quietly questioned whether they should seek independent advice, but her concerns were brushed aside. Daniel had earned their trust years earlier, and they saw no reason to question him now. Together, Robert and Jason invested a significant portion of the family's remaining savings. For several months, everything appeared exactly as Daniel promised. Regular statements arrived showing impressive growth, reinforcing their confidence that they had made the right decision. They even joked that Emily would regret walking away from such a capable husband once she saw how successful he had become. Then, without warning, the payments stopped. Phone calls went unanswered. Emails bounced back. The office where Daniel claimed the investment company operated sat completely empty. Within days, investigators announced that authorities were searching for individuals connected to an elaborate financial fraud that had affected dozens of families across multiple states. Robert stared at the television in stunned silence as photographs of people involved in the investigation appeared on the screen. Among them was the smiling son-in-law he had defended against his own daughter for years. The news shattered every certainty the family had clung to since Emily left. Detectives later confirmed that Daniel had not been the mastermind behind the operation, but he had knowingly encouraged others to invest despite repeated warnings that serious irregularities existed. His cooperation earned him reduced legal consequences, but the financial damage to everyone who trusted him had already been done. Robert lost nearly everything he had spent a lifetime saving. Jason's business collapsed under mounting debt. Linda's medical treatments became increasingly difficult to afford. Friends who had once admired the family quietly distanced themselves after learning about the scandal. The respect Robert valued so deeply disappeared almost overnight. Yet the greatest burden wasn't financial. It was the realization that the daughter they had refused to protect had tried to warn them years earlier. Every conversation they replayed in their minds sounded different now. Every excuse they had made for Daniel suddenly exposed a painful truth they had spent years refusing to face. Linda found herself unable to sleep, remembering the morning Emily called asking for somewhere safe to stay. Robert often walked through the house in silence, stopping outside the bedroom Emily had occupied before her marriage. He would stand there for several minutes before walking away again, unable to bring himself to open the door. Regret settled over the household in ways that money could never repair. Yet even after everything they had lost, none of them realized that the hardest conversations still lay ahead. A crisis was approaching that would leave them with only one person to turn to, and it was the very daughter they had abandoned when she needed them most. The financial collapse changed the Carter family in ways that were impossible to hide. The comfortable routines they had enjoyed for decades disappeared almost overnight. Robert sold the truck he had proudly maintained for years. Jason closed the office where he had built his construction company from the ground up and quietly accepted temporary work wherever he could find it. Linda began skipping some of her own medical appointments because she worried about adding more bills to a household already struggling to stay afloat. Megan, who had married only a year earlier, watched the family she had always depended on slowly unravel. Every conversation eventually returned to the same subject. If only they had listened. If only they had asked more questions. If only they had believed Emily before dismissing her pain as an overreaction. Regret became part of everyday life, but none of them possessed the courage to call the daughter they had failed so completely. They convinced themselves she would never answer, and perhaps they deserved that silence. Yet life has a way of placing people in situations where pride becomes a luxury they can no longer afford. The moment they feared most arrived on a rainy Thursday afternoon when Linda collapsed while preparing dinner. Robert rushed her to the emergency room, where doctors explained that her condition had worsened significantly and would require specialized treatment over an extended period. The medical team spoke gently, but the numbers they discussed felt impossible. Even after insurance, the cost would exceed anything the family could realistically manage. Robert sat alone in the hospital corridor staring at a folder filled with estimates, treatment schedules, and payment plans, realizing that for the first time in his life, determination alone could not solve the problem standing before him. Over the following weeks, Robert exhausted every option he could think of. He met with banks, spoke to financial advisors, contacted distant relatives, and even attempted to sell the family home that had belonged to them for nearly 30 years. The offers they received were far below what they owed, leaving them trapped between mounting debt and shrinking possibilities. Jason worked longer hours than ever before, but each paycheck disappeared almost immediately into overdue bills. Megan contributed what she could, though she and her husband were expecting their first child and had little to spare. The emotional strain affected everyone. Arguments became more frequent. Sleep became more difficult. Even simple family dinners ended in silence because no one wanted to admit how frightened they truly were. One evening, while sorting through old paperwork in search of insurance documents, Linda opened a dusty photo album that had not been touched in years. As she turned the pages, she found photographs of Emily as a little girl learning to ride her bicycle, celebrating birthdays, graduating from college, and smiling on the day she introduced Daniel to the family. Then she reached a picture taken only weeks before Emily left home forever. Looking closely, Linda noticed something she had completely overlooked at the time. Emily's smile looked forced, her eyes carried a sadness that seemed impossible to ignore now, and one sleeve covered far more of her arm than the summer weather should have required. Linda began crying so deeply that Robert rushed into the room, believing something terrible had happened. Holding the photograph in trembling hands, she whispered the words she had avoided for years. "She wasn't lying, she was asking us to save her." Robert said nothing. For the first time since Emily walked away, he allowed himself to fully accept the possibility that his daughter had told the truth from the very beginning. That realization hurt more than losing every dollar he had ever earned. Several days later, Jason received an unexpected phone call from a former coworker who happened to mention seeing Emily at a regional conference focused on supporting survivors of domestic violence. Curious and overwhelmed by guilt, Jason searched online that evening. What he discovered left him speechless. Emily had quietly built a respected career over the years. She had completed additional education, accepted a leadership role within a nonprofit organization, and frequently spoke at community events encouraging survivors to seek help before it was too late. Articles praised her compassion, professionalism, and commitment to helping families rebuild after trauma. There were photographs of her smiling confidently while standing beside community leaders, volunteers, and women whose lives she had helped change. Jason stared at the screen for a long time, hardly recognizing the frightened sister he remembered watching drive away from their parents' house. She had rebuilt everything they assumed she had lost forever. More importantly, she had done it without the support of the people who should have stood beside her from the beginning. The realization filled him with equal parts admiration and shame. He printed one of the articles and quietly placed it on the kitchen table before leaving for work the next morning. Robert found it first. He read every word without speaking. Linda read it next, wiping away tears as she reached the final paragraph describing Emily's belief that healing becomes possible when people finally choose truth over silence. None of them could escape the painful irony. The woman they once considered weak had become stronger than any of them. The daughter they dismissed had dedicated her life to protecting strangers because her own family had failed to protect her. For several more weeks, no one mentioned contacting Emily. They continued living with their regret, convincing themselves that she deserved peace after everything she had endured. Then the hospital called again. Linda's condition had become more complicated, requiring immediate treatment at a specialized medical center several hours away. Without it, her chances of recovery would decrease significantly. The emotional burden finally broke Robert's remaining pride. He sat alone in the living room late one evening, staring at Emily's childhood photograph resting on the fireplace mantel. The silence around him felt almost identical to the silence that had followed Emily's desperate plea years earlier. This time, however, he understood exactly what that silence had cost. He turned to Jason and Megan, who had quietly joined him, and admitted something they never expected to hear from the man who had always believed he was right. "I failed my daughter," he said softly. "I believed the wrong person because it was easier than facing the truth. If she never forgives me, I'll understand, but I have to tell her how sorry I am before it's too late." Linda nodded through tears, unable to speak. The decision was finally made. They would not write a letter. They would not send a message through someone else. They would go together and face whatever response Emily chose to give them. None of them expected forgiveness. They only hoped she would open the door long enough to hear the apology they should have offered years earlier. Early the next morning, the family climbed into Robert's aging sedan and began the long drive toward the city where Emily now lived. Every mile brought them closer to the daughter they had abandoned. Every mile also forced them to confront memories they had spent years trying to avoid. By the time they reached her quiet neighborhood, no one spoke anymore. Robert parked across the street and stared silently at the modest brick home where Emily had built a new life without them. Finally, he stepped out of the car, walked slowly toward the front porch with Linda beside him, and raised his trembling hand. A single knock echoed through the house. Footsteps approached from inside. The door slowly opened, and Emily looked into the eyes of the family who had once laughed when she begged for help. For several long seconds, nobody moved. Emily stood quietly in the doorway, her hand still resting on the doorknob, while the people she had spent years trying to forget stared back at her with eyes she no longer recognized. Time had changed every one of them. Robert's shoulders, once broad and confident, now seemed weighed down by years of regret. Linda looked noticeably older than her age, her face marked by exhaustion and illness. Jason avoided eye contact altogether, shifting his weight from one foot to the other as though he no longer knew where he belonged. Megan wiped away tears before they could fall. Emily had imagined this moment many times over the years, usually during sleepless nights when painful memories refused to disappear. In some versions, she slammed the door without saying a word. In others, she demanded answers they could never provide. But now that the moment had finally arrived, none of those imagined reactions felt right. She simply stood there, saying nothing. The silence grew so heavy that Robert finally broke it. His voice trembled as he spoke her name, not with authority but with the uncertainty of a father who knew he had lost the right to expect anything from his daughter. "Emily, I don't know if you'll ever forgive us. I don't even know if we deserve 5 minutes of your time, but I'm asking you to let us explain." Emily looked at each of them one by one before quietly stepping aside. "Come in," she said. "Not because everything is forgotten, but because everyone deserves the chance to tell the truth." The house reflected the peaceful life Emily had built from the ashes of her past. It wasn't extravagant or filled with expensive possessions. Instead, it carried something far more valuable: calm. Framed photographs lined one wall, showing community events, volunteer projects, and smiling groups of women whose lives had intersected with hers through the nonprofit organization she now directed. Fresh flowers rested on the dining table, and soft afternoon sunlight filled the room through large windows overlooking a small garden. Linda looked around with quiet amazement. Years earlier, she had feared Emily would never recover from leaving her marriage. Instead, her daughter had created a home filled with the very peace she had once been denied. Emily served coffee without speaking, then sat across from them with a composed expression that revealed neither anger nor warmth. Robert held the cup in both hands, unable to bring himself to drink. Finally, he began speaking. There were no excuses this time, no attempts to defend past decisions. He admitted that he had chosen comfort over truth because believing Daniel had been easier than accepting that his own daughter was living in fear. He confessed that he had confused family reputation with family responsibility. As he spoke, his voice broke repeatedly, each sentence carrying years of guilt that could no longer remain hidden. Linda apologized next, tears streaming down her face as she admitted that she had repeated the same harmful advice generations of women before her had accepted without question. She believed endurance would save Emily's marriage. Instead, it nearly destroyed her daughter's life. Jason finally lifted his eyes and whispered the words he had rehearsed throughout the drive. "You asked me to protect you." And I laughed. "I've hated myself for that every single day since I learned the truth." Emily listened without interrupting. She had waited years to hear these words, yet they did not erase the memories that still lived inside her. When everyone finished speaking, she took a slow breath before answering. "Do you know what hurt the most?" she asked softly. "It wasn't Daniel. I eventually understood who he was. What nearly broke me was realizing that I could survive the abuse but still lose the people I loved because they refused to believe me. Every time he told me no one would ever choose me over him, I wanted to prove him wrong. Then I came home, and you proved him right. No one spoke. Robert lowered his head into his hands. Linda quietly sobbed. Emily continued, her voice steady despite the emotion filling the room. She explained how she spent months sleeping in cheap motel rooms, eating one meal a day to save money, and wondering whether anyone would notice if she disappeared completely. She described sitting in parking lots after work, because she dreaded returning to an empty apartment where silence reminded her how alone she truly was. She admitted there were nights she questioned whether leaving had been worth the pain because the people she loved most had abandoned her anyway. Yet she also spoke about the strangers who eventually helped her heal, the counselor who taught her that abuse thrives in silence, and the women whose courage inspired her to rebuild instead of surrender. They became the family I needed when my own family couldn't be there, she said. That's something I'll always be grateful for, but it's also something I'll always wish had been different. Robert finally explained why they had come. He told Emily about Linda's worsening illness, the financial losses, and the difficult road that lay ahead. Emily listened carefully, but before he could finish, she gently raised her hand. I need you to understand something, she said. When I opened the door today, I already knew you weren't here because life had been easy. People usually don't travel hundreds of miles to apologize unless something has changed. Robert nodded, ashamed that she had seen through the situation so quickly. Then Emily surprised everyone. If you're wondering whether I'll help Mom receive the treatment she needs, the answer is yes. Jason looked up in disbelief. Linda covered her mouth as fresh tears rolled down her face. Robert struggled to speak. Emily continued before anyone could thank her. But listen carefully. I'm not helping because we've suddenly become the perfect family. I'm helping because I refuse to let Daniel change the kind of person I wanted to become. If I allow bitterness to control my decisions now, then he still has power over my life. I won't give him that victory. The room fell silent once again. Emily explained that through her work she had built relationships with medical charities, patient advocacy organizations, and professionals who specialized in helping families navigate situations exactly like this one. She could connect Linda with resources, assist with applications, and personally support them throughout the process. Then she looked directly at her father. The support you came here seeking isn't money, she said quietly. It's hope. Years ago I begged you to stand beside me when I had none. Today I'm choosing to stand beside you, not because the past didn't happen, but because I finally learned that compassion and boundaries can exist together. Robert slowly reached across the table, his hands shaking. Emily, he whispered, I don't know how to repay what you're doing. Emily looked at him with a mixture of sadness and peace before offering the answer he never expected. You can't repay it, she replied, but you can make sure no one else in this family ever experiences what I did. If Megan, your future granddaughter, or anyone who comes after us ever says they're being abused, don't ask them what they did wrong. Don't tell them to pray harder or stay longer. Believe them, protect them, stand beside them before it's too late. That's the only repayment I want. Robert nodded through tears, understanding that his daughter wasn't asking for revenge. She was asking for change. And in that moment, every member of the Carter family realized the greatest gift Emily could offer wasn't financial assistance at all. It was the wisdom born from surviving what should have destroyed her. The answer wasn't money alone. It was something none of them expected. It was grace without forgetting, forgiveness without surrendering her boundaries, and the courage to stop generations of silence before they could harm someone else. The weeks that followed did not erase years of pain, nor did they magically restore the family Emily had lost. Healing rarely works that way. Trust, once broken, returns slowly, and sometimes it never returns in exactly the same form. Emily kept her promise. Within days, she contacted medical specialists she had met through her nonprofit work, introduced her parents to patient advocates who understood how to navigate complex treatment programs, and helped Linda apply for financial assistance that dramatically reduced the burden of her medical expenses. She attended appointments when her schedule allowed, translated complicated medical language into simple terms her parents could understand, and made sure Linda never felt alone while facing difficult decisions. Yet Emily also protected the boundaries she had fought so hard to build. She did not move back into her parents' home, nor did she pretend the years of silence had never happened. Some evenings she returned to her quiet house carrying emotions she struggled to explain, grieving not only the childhood she once cherished, but also the years she had spent wishing for a family that could not meet her where she needed them most. Her counselor had once told her that forgiveness was not the same as pretending nothing happened. Forgiveness meant refusing to allow yesterday's pain to control tomorrow's choices. Emily repeated those words often because they reminded her that healing belonged to her, regardless of whether anyone else fully understood it. Linda's treatment lasted many months, filled with encouraging moments as well as painful setbacks. During those long hours in waiting rooms and hospital corridors, conversations began taking place that should have happened years earlier. Linda admitted how deeply she regretted repeating beliefs she had inherited without questioning them. As a young woman, she had been taught that preserving a marriage mattered more than protecting herself. She had carried that lesson into motherhood, believing she was giving wise advice when in reality she had unknowingly passed along a dangerous message. Robert spoke honestly about his own failures. He confessed that he had always believed providing for his family was the greatest measure of being a good husband and father. Looking back, he realized that listening, believing, and protecting mattered just as much. Jason apologized again and again, not because Emily demanded it, but because every memory of that afternoon on the front porch haunted him. He began volunteering at community programs that educated men about healthy relationships and the importance of recognizing abuse before it escalated. Megan, now expecting her first daughter, promised herself that she would raise her child differently. She would teach her that love should never require fear, silence, or suffering. Those conversations did not erase the past, but they slowly transformed the future. For the first time in many years, the Carter family stopped worrying about protecting appearances and started focusing on protecting one another. One crisp autumn afternoon, nearly a year after that unforgettable knock on Emily's front door, the family gathered for a small picnic in a public park not far from the hospital where Linda had completed another successful round of treatment. The atmosphere felt different from anything they had experienced before. There was laughter, but it no longer came at someone else's expense. There were conversations, but nobody interrupted when another person spoke. As the afternoon sun settled behind the trees, Robert quietly walked over to Emily, who stood watching children play in the distance. After a long silence, he reached into his jacket pocket and handed her a small envelope. Inside was a faded photograph from her wedding day. Emily looked at it for a moment before noticing something written carefully across the back in Robert's familiar handwriting. "I should have protected my daughter before I protected my pride. Thank you for giving me the chance to become the father I should have been." Emily read the words twice before gently folding the photograph and placing it back into the envelope. She hugged her father for the first time in many years. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Some moments are too honest for words, and this was one of them. Life continued moving forward just as it always does. Emily expanded the nonprofit organization she had helped build, reaching more women and families every year. She shared her story privately with those who needed hope, never presenting herself as someone extraordinary, but simply as proof that a painful beginning does not have to determine the ending. Robert and Linda became outspoken supporters of domestic violence awareness in their local community, often telling friends that the hardest lesson they ever learned was that abuse can exist behind the brightest smiles and the most respected reputations. Jason rebuilt his business slowly, this time placing character above appearances when choosing business partners and friendships. Megan welcomed a healthy baby girl into the world and often smiled as she watched Emily become the kind of aunt every child deserves. The family never forgot what happened. They chose instead to remember it honestly, allowing those painful memories to shape better decisions rather than deeper divisions. Daniel, meanwhile, faded quietly into the past. His name appeared occasionally in legal records and old newspaper articles, but he no longer occupied space in Emily's heart. She had discovered something far more valuable than revenge. She had found peace. And peace, she realized, is often the greatest victory a survivor can ever claim. As this story comes to an end, perhaps the most important question isn't whether Emily's family deserved another chance. Perhaps the better question is this: what would you have done if someone you loved came to you and quietly admitted they were living in fear? Would you have looked beyond appearances? Would you have believed them even if the truth was difficult to accept? Too many people remain trapped in abusive relationships because they fear no one will believe them. Sometimes all it takes to change the course of someone's life is one person willing to listen without judgment and stand beside them without hesitation. Emily's story reminds us that silence protects the wrong people, while compassion has the power to change generations. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed a situation where someone wasn't believed until it was almost too late? What would you have done if you were in Emily's place? We'd truly love to hear your perspective. And if you enjoy powerful stories of resilience, betrayal, redemption, and hope, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story. Thank you for spending this time with us, and until next time, remember that choosing kindness, believing those who ask for help, and having the courage to stand beside the vulnerable can change a life forever.